Hello and welcome to episode 90 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. Um, so this time we're still in the thick of looking at the third uh, product here, which has a theoretical mechanism. So we've been talking about ways in which some of these systems uh, construct or are embedded with artifice, in part because artifice is sort of a relevant term in a lot of these conversations about things like generative AI as we sort of sidle from um, Turk-like systems where there's ostensibly, a kind of uh, cleaner split between the human and the non, um, to where we get to things like generative AI, where, as books like Literary Theory for Robots have suggested, the uh, assembly of human labor is opaque in some ways. So, in conversations about these tools, artifice seems to be a key term. Sometimes it's pejorative, right? It's something to exterminate in a
Right.
technocratic way. Sometimes it's used as sort of like the key difference between the human, right? There was just a piece, Ted Chiang just had a piece. Did you see this about how machines will
No,
never make art? Did you see that one?
I did not.
Ooh,
Man.
it just came out.
Although I always recommend his life cycle of software objects short story is great.
So
One
let me
visit. Sorry.
share this. Of course. Why AI isn't going to make art. That's kind of an interesting uh, argument reminiscent of one of our previous guests, where, like, because AI doesn't have lived experience,
Yeah.
it can't produce what we understand art to be.
Which follows from his I mean from that short story is that intelligence is experiential, which is not opposed to some idea of artifice. The experience itself is a kind of artifice for intelligence.
Let's see, and that was thinking in particular. Uh, let's see, that was Annette V,
Yeah.
who uh, potentially was making a similar kind of move about human lived experience and potentially
Yeah.
how it's irreproducible in certain ways. But anyway, so I mean, we're looking at, and art is interesting, particularly, its etymological connections to artifice and artifact, right? Art.
Yeah.
The idea of something that is composed or constructed might be useful because, I mean, what we were kind of chewing over last time was, is what we're bringing to this discussion, um, this notion of being able to read artifice for particular outcomes, or to produce particular insights, right?
Yeah.
And this was something like we were just kind of reviewing because heretofore we'd been kind of categorizing what we were calling case studies, um, different things where, I wonder why that won't move, where artifice seems to be present, and we were categorizing them into sort of things associated with rhetoric as a discipline. So things like persuasion, things like
Mhm.
conflict. But previously, we were kind of examining whether that was unsatisfying theoretically in some ways, because then it kind of becomes like almost circular, where it's, here are things that are conflict, and now we'll prove that by examining them as conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we kind of landed on trying to give, as we were originally, well, originally is not fair, but at some point, trying to see these systems as themselves theorizing
Yeah.
rather than identifying in them predetermined concepts.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's where we were.
Yeah. I mean, right. We sort of realized we were potentially thinking or writing ourselves back into a kind of, let's identify what these features are, as opposed to, um, yeah, sort of trace them from within or something like that. So, which I think led us back to, again, like the concepts of readability and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think those situations, those things we were identifying as case studies may be valuable, but maybe not deployed in the way we were considering deploying them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because like, and because this came up, it's like, well, then what is otherwise it's like, well, what is the paper doing? Right? It's like, as in like, what are we writing about? If we're not observing stuff, what is the piece doing? So I think like those things we've assembled as case studies, still not all of them, but some of them may be valuable. And then I think you were kind of aligning on, the act of reading those is the work of the paper, perhaps.
Yeah. Right. I mean, given the idea that we have, the first two pieces have shaped our thinking in particular ways, right? The time we spent inside Mechanical Turk, um, how has that set up a way of reading that we could then, given what we've learned across the arc of this project, how might we take these what we find particularly compelling or relevant examples, um, and then make sense of them some way from as inside the artifice as possible. I mean, I'm thinking if you could pull up the one you shared, the AI checkers forcing kids to write like a robot to avoid
Yeah.
being called a robot. It just even between our warm up and now, as you were talking and I wasn't listening, um, that it strikes me as it's potentially an example of a kind of reading of AI, which is this moment where my kid, the the way this person writes the kid, which I kind of like the way that they describe their child, um, and the thing spits out that there's I think they're using
14%, right? Or
yeah, and they're basically right like one of the lines is at this point the hunt began to figure out what could possibly be causing the 17% score. The immediate target, right? So there's a sense in which they're reading this artifice to figure out what's going on within it that's generating this particular outcome.
yeah.
So there's partially it's that, right? It's an attempt to kind of there's the I guess you could say there's an original move to a kind of a search for transparency.
Yeah.
But then what happens is it becomes something else, right? Like it turns out they couldn't get to the bottom of it, right? The 17% is just it would go they would take it out and put something back in, but it still kept coming up to 17%. Um, and so right at the moment where this instinct for transparency as the solution, right? Again, the kind of technocratic, apolitical, if we could just figure out what makes it, we can cut through the artifice of AI, we can We
Yeah.
can now know what to do with it. There's then this pivot away of what writing in the context of an AI checker does to student writing.
Yeah.
So it's a move, it's an original move to transparency, which I think is, as we've discussed before, we're less interested in because it it's a move away from artifice, and it's another sort of a centralizing move.
Yeah.
That if we could know why it's saying 17%, that would, well, it wouldn't really solve the larger problem that the author gets to, which is it's this is now the artifice in which my child's learning how to write.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's going to constrain, or in this sense, right, constrain their vocabulary or whatever, right? That it's so I think there's like an interesting sort of two-part move there, where I think that the instinct for someone, I think, and who, I mean, is obviously writing for a, you know, there's someone in tech, um, so their instinct is to figure out, right, the how this works. But what they realize is it's actually more important to look at the work that it's doing as an artifice,
Mhm.
right? Not sort of unpacking it, but tracing what it does.
Yeah.
Um, and that way of reading and writing, I think, is interesting to us, right? Not what not how AI is structured to deceive, but what particular kinds of things, I don't know, how it then shapes the way that people withhold or don't withhold information, or the way that intent gets construed. And
Yeah. And that piece, as we were talking about, I feel it's a companion, and this has come up for me a lot recently, um, because I'll talk to folks, particularly because I was doing that summer thing for my institution's Center for Teaching Excellence, where we were looking at incorporating generative AI into classes. And, a fairly kind of common conversation I'd have had to do with like the limits of this, or when does it get to this point or whatever. And one thing I found myself talking about was we have to accept that these non-human readers and writers will, as they have for a long time, I mean, they'll shape the culture of reception such that, like, as we see in this case with this kid, right? It's like this is a pretty dramatic one, but it's normalizing that particular kind of writing. It's like you have to meet my expectations here.
yeah.
And I talk to folks about, there are obvious examples of things like printing. Like my daughter never learned cursive. Why did print become so dominant? Well, one of the many reasons is because it was machine readable. I mean, there's
Mm-hmm.
other reasons, but it's like it's was easier for machines to scan those things, so it became the default printing, right? And the companion piece for this, and this has come up for us previously, this notion of, as we've talked about this, um, recursion or model
Mm.
collapse, or the Habsburg AI, right? So this is one of a number of pieces that have come out that says the headline here is AI appears to be slowly killing itself. What it's talking about is, and there was a study, I can't remember if it was this one, but like, did you see the recent thing that said like 54% of the web is now auto-generated?
Oh no, I
Let me check that. And then of course it's like, well, how are you? Let me see your methodology in that. Was it 54%? This is probably a January 19. It was more recent than that. Well, I'd have to track it down, but there was a recent sort of wave of studies about how much of the web is auto-generated. And this is kind of playing on that because it's like, it says this stuff is flooding the web because of generative AI. And that's tricky because that means the training data for generative AI has been produced by generative AI. And so it leads to the Habsburg or the model collapse where, it's eating its own dog food. So any biases just kind of get, pushed forward. And right. I mean, the Habsburg AI image is because it's incestuous, right? It's generating material that it's then using to train itself to produce more material. We
Yeah.
also, what was that visual thing? That fusion between, was it a Yoko, the yo-yo snail thing? You remember that?
Yes.
And that was a similar
Yeah.
kind of situation where it had, kind of recursively hallucinated these things where like it was the CAPTCHA was asking you to select Yokos.
Sounds familiar. I've run across some weird, I've gotten some weird captures that made no sense recently. Like it was asking me to parse images that I couldn't parse. They were weird.
Yeah, gosh. Speaking of memory, I can't believe I had this right at hand, but
There you
yeah, that's
go.
it. Um, and this was kind of a similar kind of thing, but I mean, like, all of this is to say, it's interesting that this is being framed as collapse. It's
Yeah.
interesting this is being framed as, well, it's become incestuous because what's being overlooked in that is it's like, well, that's just what the web is now. My evidence for that is look what that kid is being compelled to write, where it's like,
Right.
when this is producing and then generating, it's generating this stuff, it's training on, it's generating it. And we see that as like, well, it's collapse, but that sidesteps, but that's just what the culture of reception is now.
Right. It's
And it's
interesting.
happening quick.
It's interesting too because you go back, and I don't know, I'm no expert in the Habsburgs, so I'll put that out right now. That weirdly, and there could be other things that were wrong with them genetically, but it's weird that I've been imagining, right? So dabble enough in disability studies that to refer to like the Habsburg chin
Yeah.
as a deformity as opposed to some sort of genetic purity is a weird, like it's potentially telling that that's the model that we're using, right? Because there's a sense in which maybe this is what you're getting at too, right? Like this is somehow like an artificial collapse. I don't know. There's a weird sense in which we could read into this as we've done before, right? Like our evidence that artifice is I don't know, the word I've been using is sort of embarrassing to sort of both crudely drawn sides, right?
Yeah.
Like the humanist response is it's not natural, it's artificial, it's
Mhm.
not truly human intelligent. But weirdly, I think some people in AI are embarrassed by artifice, and it shows up precisely when they start talking about model collapse because they seem to be assuming that we'll finally know it's really intelligent when we can seal it off,
Right.
don't have to keep feeding it new stuff.
Right. That it when it if it needs continual like input and maintenance, then it's not self-sustaining and therefore
Yes. And I think weirdly enough that at that point those are two sides of the same coin. There's some no I mean going back to our earlier work on extended cognition, right? That what the mind finally is this self-sealed
yeah.
thing. Um and it strikes me that in moments like this, these sort of two broad proponents and opponents of AI um, link up in some ways.
Well, and embedded in this notion, this article, right, where it's like where it's slowly killing itself, or I mean, clearly embedded in that is a notion of if we have auto-generated material out there, that's artificial stuff. We're being robbed of the purity of the pre-generated web where it was just humans doing stuff. And of course, that's a fiction, but it's like, no, once that thing starts talking in there, like the pool is getting polluted by
Yeah,
fake stuff. But it's like, but that's the pool we're in.
yeah,
It's like it's not fake.
it's
That's
really
the stuff
there,
that's in the pool.
right?
It's like, no, we need to get the artificial stuff out so we can just plumb the actual human interaction. It's like, but in this sphere, they are all players in this, right?
Yeah,
We humans will be writing for a polluted web.
yeah, yeah. You can't then sort of retroactively parse it, which it's weird too, because it's sort of like, somebody who's someone who's like mining for oil, complaining about how all the oil everywhere prevents them from getting to the stuff that they want. It's like, well, then, I mean, you're the ones that poisoned it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the contemporary, if you were to start an LLM today and train it on the web,
Yeah,
I would say that's exactly as natural a training as an LLM that was two
yeah,
decades ago, because
that,
it's like, but that's what the web is now. You can't say no, the real web is the one without all this stuff in it. It's like,
yeah.
but
Oh,
that's not what the web is now.
yeah. What's that?
That
Oh,
would be a make America great again fictitious belief about the pre-polluted, pre-lapsarian
right.
web that doesn't exist.
Yeah. That reminds me. So this is a media guy in com, John Durham Peters. This book's fantastic, The Marvelous Clouds. But he basically points out he's in part he's working through some of the stuff that I think we're interested in, right? Some of the kind of, I lost the term for it there. I don't know, for lack of it, like sort of our Latourian instincts, right? The notion of the trouble of the subject object split and stuff like that. And so the difference between the knower and the known and that kind of stuff. But he in there he kind of makes the argument, right, that the internet is a map of itself. There's no distinction between, right, that's what the discourse is now.
Yeah.
Like there's
And it also foolishly, as we can see from that case with the kid, it suggests if you could somehow separate out all of the auto-generated stuff on the internet, then you'd have this natural human speech. It's like, but humans are increasingly being cultivated by that web to write
right.
for that web. If you traced it out, they'd still be writing for that culture of reception. That kid would still be writing that way.
Yeah.
It undervalues the, I know Casey doesn't like it, but like the agency of the non-human contribution there to shape what we mean by writing.
Yeah.
It's not just mimicking it, it's participating in the
Participating in it.
context of
Yeah.
reception.
Yeah. No, and I think that, I mean, that's what we've talked about before. I think one of the things that I like, or that keeps me coming back around to accepting non-pejoratively the concept of artifice, is it then foregrounds precisely that notion of participation. If the artifice isn't then at some point reducible to some kernel, then the artifice is whatever is partaking of the artifice. So in that sense, anything's participation in that artifice has an impact on what that art, it reminds me of I use this all the time when I teach like a public, you know, is the German expression, you aren't in traffic, you are traffic.
Mm.
Like you aren't on the internet, you are the internet, right? You aren't in an artifice, you are the artifice. Like these are not discrete spaces you enter into. If everyone left the internet, it wouldn't be the internet anymore, right? It would be something else, right? It's um and
Leave
then
it
it
to the Germans.
and then it generates those things within it, right? Like the students and teachers don't enter into a classroom. They become students and teachers within
Yeah.
the artifice that is the classroom. And then when I'm not a teacher all the time. I'm a teacher in that particular arrangement of things. the artifice of higher ed that, whatever.
Yeah. I think it was also there was the German wood pusher term, right? Wasn't that
Yeah, for chess. Oh God, what was it
like
in
the
German?
actual German? I don't remember. I just remember
No.
it's
I'll
translated
tell
as
you,
the
remember the translation, which for us is funnier.
um but yeah, it was, kind of like grinders, people who aren't gifted at it, but yeah. Speaking up because like, it still returns to the question of then what then is the paper doing? Right?
Yeah,
We still have it,
that pesky question.
huh?
That pesky question.
Yeah.
It's creating opportunities for us to talk.
Um, well, and there were a couple of things because like, I've been like tweaking the outline, although, and that's the job of an outline where it's like it's not clear how much of that should be retained or whatever. But like recently there was so Neuralink, one of the places where he's got his dirty little fingers, they produced a neural chip that its intention is to read brain signals and then translate that into action in some sort.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it was interesting because one of the things, big surprise, that they're doing with it is, right, it allows someone who's paralyzed to play chess, right? It's like that's one of the first things to trot out. I think one of them also was playing other video games. I'd have to track that, but I think it was like maybe Counter-Strike or something. But chess, of course, once again, kind of fills this role of, here's someone who's potentially like a paraplegic. We put on this brain scan thing, and it's like to demonstrate its utility or aptitude or whatever. It's like, well, now have them demonstrate playing chess. Mention that because, we still have the frame of this as the chess inversion, right? We're at a point where um, the original Mechanical Turk, people were incredulous because it's like there's no way a a machine could do that. There's got to be a dude hidden inside there. And
Mm-hmm.
now with the cheating scandal, the anal bead cheating scandal, it's like there's no way that person could be doing that. There's got to be a machine in there, right? We went from the man in the machine to the machine in the man. I mean, it's still a useful parable, but like I don't know if it's framing the paper. I mean, this information on artifice seems to be still appropriate. Do. This is what rhetoric brings to the dialogue: saturation and discursive artifice. It's our thing.
Yeah. I mean, maybe too and maybe this is kind of what we were hitting on, right? That figuring out that what we're trying to write is a performance of saturation and discursive artifice. Like, what does that look like? What does that sound like? It's kind of again why I think this is, that even the fact that it's you know, more of a blog post that's inspired by this moment of a kid bringing homework, right? Sort of strikes as a moment of saturation and a discursive artifice.
Yeah.
And then what are takeaways from that style of this writer reading this situation? And that move that's interesting when there's the move away from the seeming drive to transparency, right? Trying to figure out, even then the drive to transparency is executed through tweaking and playing with the artifice. Because that, to a certain extent, right, that's all the author has available. Like I can't go to Turnitin or whatever it is and go to Grammarly and start looking at the code. But I can enter this version of the essay and find out what happens.
Right.
Right. There's a sense in which that's a way of reading the artifice is you got to participate in it. And then how does that participation in the artifice make you aware of attune you to particular consequences of that artifice? In the same way that we posted hits, participated in Turk, and then learned some things based on how the Turkers responded, like the captions they generated, the ways they responded to the surveys.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
So that way
This,
it's kind of echoing the moves of the earlier pieces too.
yeah, I mean, you could potentially see a trajectory, from the first one where it was less, arguably less engaged and more a deciphering of, I mean, we talked about this, that it's, who was it? Was it Kegel maybe brought this up where it's like we were getting the stuff from it and then making sense of the stuff. The second one required uh, a degree more of participation in it. Possibly this third piece continues that trajectory.
Yeah, and then what are the yeah, I mean it also occurred to me, right? That's why we did readability and not trauma.
Yeah.
Because we knew we were participating in it, right? Like which I think is particularly compelling given our understanding of how these things you can't help but shape this artifice every time you try to learn something about it because you have to participate in it. Like I went on ChatGPT to explore what ChatGPT is. You're now part of ChatGPT,
Yeah.
even if you weren't before, because it was probably scraping your email or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, it was part of the thing I was doing in the summer and then with my students now. So we pay for Microsoft's Copilot,
Okay.
and what that gets you is an assurance that they're not keeping your stuff. So when you use it, and this also came up with ChatGPT, who introduced the pay tier. I think it was called ChatGPT for Business. You know, of course, corporations, and looking at these tools are like, well, we can't give you our
Right.
material, right? I mean, let alone stuff that's like privileged, like medical data. And so they needed some means to leverage the model, but not become part of it. And so
Yeah.
now what you're getting, what you're paying for really, really is indemnification. They're assuring us that they're not keeping the stuff we give it. Therefore, if it does somehow get out there, we won't get sued. They will. But it is interesting that like what we're paying for is to be out of that kind of participation with it. And a
Wow.
consequence of that is it's a lot less useful because it can't store your previous interactions, or it doesn't. And like you can ask it, it's like, do you remember what you were talking about yesterday? And it'll say, no, I can't recall that because I don't keep any of that stuff that you give me. Whereas
Yeah.
ChatGPT does, remember to an extent, you can have it recall things, and it also collects your previous chats, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you use it, you see it does that, as will Copilot if you're not paying it. You know,
That's
because like I've logged in with just a personal account on Copilot, and it acts similar. It's worse,
yeah.
but it acts similar to Chat GPT. So it's interesting that what we're paying for is like less functionality because
That's
we're not participating.
maybe you just write about that.
Might.
I mean that it's also really interesting because it it nicely, I think, echoes when I was doing a lot of reading on like attention and the attention economy and that kind of thing. It's the way that you what you pay for when you get like Hulu Premium is you don't get the ads.
Right.
There's a sense in which you opt out of having to participate in that kind of attentional economy. Um, but interestingly, in this, right, you lose. Yeah, that really does get at the kind of participatory nature of the artifice. The idea is that if you don't want it to remember, if you don't want to leave a footprint in it, you're conceivably getting less
Yeah.
functionality from it.
This shows up in other ways too. And I was writing a tangential piece about this, but like, so one consequence of this Habsburg AI thing is that a lot of entities that control bodies of content on the web, on the internet, have started to like silo. The example I was writing about, it's one of the clearest ones, is Reddit. Reddit has said they made some changes where they said there are artificial intelligences that are training on our material because Reddit, I don't know your involvement with it, but it's like a giant bulletin board system where groups are kind of self-coalesce into affinity groups, right?
Mm,
There's a subreddit for everything. Every weird thing you're into, there's already a group for it. And if there's somehow not, you can actually create your own. But so what's really interesting is it's like, in a sense, it's this really now valuable archive of human interaction. Like that's
yeah,
what, and so those who control Reddit said, we're not giving that away anymore. If you want to scrape this material, and what's in, there's a lot of interesting components. One of them is like the main way to enforce this is um, a protocol where it's like they can't really stop it exactly. What you can do mostly is make changes to the robots.txt file, which, as its name implies, is just the text file that sits at the top level of web servers. And it says, here's what you can and can't do. However, I don't believe there's any force of weight behind that other than just convention,
yeah.
right? But anywho, so Reddit has said you can't have this stuff. We're going to license it, and they have entered into licensing agreements with OpenAI and Google, I believe, probably others at this juncture,
Mhm.
and said, okay, you guys can scrape this. They've even excluded web search engines. So, and we're seeing this kind of across the web where there's a
Uh,
lot of siloing where they're saying you can't have access to this. So it's like, in a sense, the open internet, there's a way to see it as like becoming balkanized right now,
oh,
where it's, and this gets really complicated because like it's funny for Reddit to say that because it's like, well, you pricks don't own this stuff anyway. The people who participate in Reddit made this,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and what it's interesting, it's like
yeah,
a quid pro quo where like Reddit's has said it's like, well, what you get out of this is community, but what they get out of it is a fat paycheck. It's
yeah.
like there's
Uh-huh.
different levels of compensation here. Um,
Does that then affect um so theoretically the more it gets siloed, the worse search engines get.
yeah, I mean, the internet stops being like an open, I often quail at using these kinds of terms, but yes, it's
Yeah.
like search engines will be worse. The LLMs may not necessarily be training on like the same data because they're only going to be training on the ones they have paid access to.
Yeah.
So it's like you can't really count on, well, this is seen at all out there. It's like, well, it's seen what it was
And
licensed to see.
yeah. And thus it can only scrape what doesn't have the capacity to God, why am I thinking the immediate analogy I came to because we're talking about this in class is one of the things that was revealed after I mean it was already the case, but now we know, or more people know, after the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, right? There was this big report about why, right? And a lot of it has to do with predatory policing. And the reason that predatory policing is the case is that in the 60s, You had all these unincorporated areas in the county. And if you're unincorporated, HUD could come in and put in low income housing. So what you did is you incorporated. So like 95 cul-de-sacs all became cities overnight to protect them, to basically to protect themselves from being,
Yeah.
I don't know, overridden with the pores. And of course, realized 40 years later, they didn't make a city based on the capacity to pay for it, right? There's no tax, just so they have to use predatory policing to fund themselves. Anyway, right? So the only part of the web that will get scraped are the parts of the web that don't have the wherewithal to do what Reddit does, which is protect itself or to cordon itself off.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think it's Antonio, is it Antonio Berg,
Yeah,
who has that piece about like why you should make your stuff public because the hyperbolic statement is like, well, do you want the AIs that are going to control everything to be trained only on Twitter and 4chan? Is that what you
yeah,
want? It's
yeah,
like, if not, you need to make sure your ethics are represented, which means making your stuff accessible.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and it was interesting because this other piece we were writing, because like we were looking at different databases and yeah, I mean ones that are like one of them was an indigenous language database, and it was curiously like completely unprotected, which we anticipated it would be because those kinds of metrics have been used against indigenous people in a lot of ways. And so we assumed it's like, well, they'll be really protective. There's a concept called indigenous data sovereignty,
Huh.
which posits that information about indigenous peoples should remain under their control. You could see it as a subcategory of data sovereignty, which has to do with like nation states' ability to like prosecute their
Mhm.
own laws against data that is either housed on servers within their, sphere of influence or other things like that. But yeah, I mean, it's like kind of interesting about, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how like free information plays out in the wake of these kinds of things where it's like, will that be seen as like lower quality or
Yeah. I mean, there's the idea that what LLMs essentially create is that they've overnight. I mean, this has maybe been true already because um, but I guess in a more explicit, obvious ways, they've overnight monetized everything on the internet.
yeah,
Like
which
even
is
like my blog doesn't have to. I don't have to have right. My YouTube channel. I don't have to now have ads on my blog to monetize it because it
yeah.
simply being on the internet now makes it monetizes it, right? Like as soon as you invent like now we've got cars, well, guess what? Everything under the ground just got monetized.
Well, and to return it to our previous pieces, that value is because this is ostensibly human stuff,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it's like
yeah.
that's why like the Habsburg discussion is kind of interesting because it's like you can see in a monetary sense why Reddit would be valuable. It's this gold mine of quote unquote general, authentic
Yep.
human, these are real usable human bones made out of squirrel bones put in a pizza oven. Um, yeah, where it's like you can see why. So yeah, I mean that's an interesting point where it's like you don't need to stick ads in your
No,
YouTube video. It just needs to be you talking because
yeah,
that's what's valuable.
that's gold dust. It's you, but not it's not they need you, not max headroom.
What we're doing right now has
Now, yeah.
monetary value.
We should have a little counter going up in the corner.
But
Um,
it's interesting because it's like, and this is working its way through the courts. It's like, well, should people be compensated for that in some way? And like ethically, yes, but realistically, not a fucking chance. It's
yeah.
like
I logged on the internet today. Where's my money?
there's a universe. I'm sure this already exists in speculative fiction where it's like, yeah, you'd be getting a fraction of a penny for doing what we're doing now because yeah, it
Yeah.
becomes training material.
We're all
It,
Richard Pryor now.
um, but uh, I'd be surprised
Yeah, I don't.
if
Yeah.
if in the near term that's what happens. What'll happen in part because of like we're just not like legally or um, socially set up for it. I mean, what'll happen is what we see with Reddit, where it's like two people who have a claim over that content will be enriched.
Yeah.
Everyone who generated that content, they're not
Yeah.
going to get anything. They're going
This
to
is
get
America. This is America. The labor actually producing the value will see none of the like. We've got a system in place for you not getting compensated for your labor already.
yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, it's like that's why because this is just another outgrowth. It will be because that's the framework we have, right?
Yes.
So it's like, well, how does this new thing fit into that framework? Because trying to change that. I mean, every now and then I read about someone who's got a compensation scheme that will address these problems. And it's like, there's no way. Like, how would that even, like, would it be some kind of federal law? It's like, there's just not structured for this kind of stuff where it's like, what'll happen is someone will control that content. Our YouTube stuff will be valuable to Google because they can sell it, but you and I won't see a goddamn dime.
No.
I mean, it is interesting because the tension against that is, as you already mentioned, monetization, where it's like there are people, a very small fraction, who like, do YouTube professionally and they get monetized. So there's a world in which it's like, well, that's what it'll become, where it's like we'll take the ads out, but because you get so much traffic,
Yeah.
we know you're valuable. Now we're gonna ram ads in there, but like we can sell this as
Yeah.
this is human interaction that is of a higher quality than
Yeah.
our videos that get, 5 views from you and me.
Yeah.
One that's getting a lot of eyeballs. We don't need to stuff ads in there. It's just like this is the primo human shit.
Yeah. It's like OnlyFans, but for LLMs.
Yes.
And that got him thinking.
Yeah. But yeah, oh yeah, and we're already,
Yeah.
as I mentioned, speaking of human frailty, I apparently have an eye appointment today.
Yeah. Um,
Potentially the second one in my life, as I mentioned, the first being
man,
last year.
you can
It's
make get
funny
all
because
the
I
get all
think
the
I see
tests.
okay.
Maybe you
Yeah, I don't
got
know.
scares or I'm
What's
worried
that?
about your corneas.
Well, what's interesting is it's like sometimes, like I'll be rubbing an eye and all of a sudden it's like, what? Like everything's in HD. And like, oh, that probably means something, right?
Okay. Is maybe the reason you've avoided going to the eye doctor is you're worried they're going to discover that you're a replicant.
Yeah, they did do the Voight comp. Um,
My eyesight's bad, but I know what I would do to the turtle.
it wasn't avoidance. It was just it didn't come up, you know? And
I mean, good for you, man.
well, and oddly, it's like when I left, they're like, you're basically all right. They said, it's
Yeah.
like, they actually asked, do you want glasses? And I was like, this seems like an odd
Yeah.
question.
I didn't think that was an option.
Yeah.
Gonna ruin my whole look. I take
Um,
my glasses off and my children get angry at me.
be like shaving. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all out. Okay. Well, yeah.
Well, but so yeah, I mean, and that the co-pilot thing might be an interesting route
Yeah.
in because it speaks to this thing about like participation.
Maybe
And,
that's
and and Reddit's a useful one too because like when they made these changes in their privacy statement, they said it addresses, can I opt out of this? Like if I'm someone who contributes to Reddit, who writes posts, can I opt out of having my stuff scanned? And they were like, sure, stop using Reddit. Like that was kind of there, although it wasn't even quite that because they don't want you to do that. But it was like, well, you can participate in private ones or you can manually delete all your stuff. It was like in order to opt out, it was like super late. You had to change the way
yeah.
you interacted with communities because it's like, well, what if a lot of the communities I belong to aren't private? Well, you're SOL. What if I want my stuff not to be there? Well, you can manually delete it, and we assure you that it won't be accessible. It was interesting because it was like, in order for you to opt out, you couldn't just opt out. You had to dramatically change your interaction with the platform.
Yeah,
And, this is in the same document that harps on community as being like, what you're getting out of this is community.
yeah.
Can I still do that? No.
No.
No, if you don't want us to sell your stuff, then no.
Now we're all Brad Pitt at the end of what is it, Killing Me Softly?
Haven't seen it.
He's going to get a guy who owes him money, and Obama is giving a speech on the TV about how we're in a community, and Brad Pitt goes, "You kidding me? This is America. This is a business. Give me my fucking money." So he basically says, "This isn't a community. This is a business."
We're all
Uh,
offended.
anyway, yeah, the participation thing I think is interesting, and then the idea, right? You don't just opt out; you have to become another kind of user.
Interesting.
Suggests that the participation is shaping you, right? You aren't a natural human. You're a particular kind of human given the kind of taskscape you're in. And you can't be that, you can't remain that kind of person if you don't like this taskscape, because the taskscape creates its own human intelligence, its own human community. So of course you can't just opt out. You have to become other to make it work.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Well, yeah, we'll have to wrap it up, but
get them peepers checked.
well, we didn't get a chance to talk about that. There's that, what is it, a QJS or an RSQ or
RSQ, yeah. But I think I'm going to try to get one of those authors on, and so maybe we can set it aside for that issue for episode.
all right.
Okay,
Well, we will at some point. These things seem to be getting kind of like they're
we'll
not
get
structured.
yeah, we got to get back into a rhythm,
You're right.
a
All right, we'll
regimen.
figure that out.
All right, bye.